Welcome to another edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective, a Utah Jazz podcast giving you an Upper Bowl point of view with courtside quality. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-hosts Landon and Kyler. And boys, this offseason, we have had a lot of things to talk about already in our first few episodes. We have talked about some new things, like with the Jazz's new rebrand and the color schemes. We've also talked about some of the old things moving away, like Quinn Snyder stepping down as Utah Jazz head coach. And today we get to talk a little bit about both of those. Just today, we're recording this on Tuesday. The Jazz had two new signings in their front office organization. They hired Will Hardy out of the Boston Celtics coaching organization as their new head coach. And they also hired David Fizdale, a longtime assistant and head coach in the league, to their front office as an associate GM. So two big hirings that we've been waiting for to see what we get news on for a long time, and they finally dropped today. We'll go into some of the backgrounds on David and Will here in a couple minutes, but what were your initial reactions when you saw those Bleacher Report notifications coming through saying that Will Hardy is going to be joining the Jazz?
I mean, he's along the lines, you know how I wanted Adrian Griffin in our first episode that we did. He's along those lines where he's the young first-time head coach. He's from, I think he's from winning programs. You said we'll get into his history later, but so maybe not the guy that I had my eye on. I was kind of Adrian Griffin or Jason Terry were kind of the guys I was rooting for, but certainly the guy that I'm not disappointed in.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised too. I mean, maybe just because this wasn't a guy that was talked about as much, and we didn't talk about him as much when we went over our potential coaching hires. I thought if they were going to go this route, they would have gone with a guy like Johnny Bryant. With that said, though, I'm pretty happy with him. I've heard nothing but good things about Will Hardy. I think he'll probably do a great job. I think his age is interesting to me. So he is the same age as Mike Conley, who's going to be the youngest head coach in the NBA. And so I feel like to get this job I feel like in a management position like this, there's some bias that comes with experience and age, like kind of in their favor. So like he must have really blown the Jazz organization away with what he had to say to be the guy they went with at just 34 years old.
Yeah, I mean, as Landon mentioned, he's going to be the youngest head coach in the league when he steps onto the court this fall. Just for a little bit of background, he joined the San Antonio Spurs organization in 2010, right after he graduated college. He then spent from 2010 till 2015 as a video coordinator. He actually led that department at the Spurs organization from 2013 to 15, where he was very much trusted of Greg Popovich, and then later moved on to an assistant head coach role with the Spurs for another few years. He then left the Spurs organization just this last season to go join Ime Udoka at the Boston Celtics, help lead them to a finals run. And he was the top assistant there in Boston. So even though he is only 34 years old and he's only been in the league now in a coaching position for, what is it now, since 2015, like 7 years, he's had a pretty eventful 7 years in terms of who he's coached with, who he's coached under, and the success of the teams that he's been involved with. So there's a lot to get excited for there. We didn't talk about him near as much as we did several other candidates when we did our original pod on the Jazz's head coaching candidates. And even though he's young, he has a lot of pedigree. I think there was a reason why he didn't come up in our conversations, because he wasn't an obvious candidate. People like a Terry Stotts, who has a lot of head coaching experience, or even like a Johnny Bryant, who has closer ties to Utah Jazz, all seem to make more sense on paper. What do you think ultimately led the Jazz to make the decision to go with a guy like Will Hardy, who, although he's had an impressive career so far, it's been a very short career, and he doesn't have near the same head coaching experience as somebody else may have? So what do you think really put him over the edge from your perspective, or what have you heard?
I mean, honestly, for me, I think you look at he had experience under Greg Popovich with the Spurs, like you said, and the Jazz recently had success with that with Quinn Snyder. He also has ties to the Boston organization, which is something that Danny Ainge is really close to. So I feel like not only do you have a lot of ties in the interview process where he can blow you away, but you get the inside scoop with Boston from Danny Ainge, right? He's going to have a very confident word in how he was in Boston beyond just kind of the interview process. So on both those levers, I think there's just extreme comfort in the ties to Boston and with Popovich. So that's why I think maybe he got the final leg up.
Yeah, it's hard to overlook the ties to Boston. I think that was definitely a factor into this. I'm sure that's a big reason why he got the interview, which is fine. Again, I don't know a whole lot about it. It was just announced today. What I've read and kind of some of the quotes, his style, he seems like a very high energy, like get you motivated type of person, which is maybe what the Jazz are looking for at this point when they're looking to, kind of refresh or brand a little bit. They probably want a young, energetic face at the head of that, someone who can really motivate the guys and kind of get them, united and kind of excited about a common goal. So, I mean, my initial first impression, that might be why, is just he seems like a very high energy, highly motivated person.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we're going from Quinn Snyder, who is one of the most well-regarded coaches in the league. Probably most people had him as a solid tier 2 coach in terms of the best coaches in the league, who was a little bit older, had a lot of coaching experience. And now we're going to a guy who's much, much younger. What do you think is going to be different about a Will Hardy coached Utah Jazz team compared to a Quinn Snyder coached Jazz team? What differences do you think we're going to see?
I mean, as Landon mentioned, just when you have a young coach, you expect the energy levels to be high. They haven't aged as much. They got a lot more left in the tank, and just a ton of charisma. I think there's a relatability to the players. Like you said, like Landon said, he's the same age as Mike Conley, and so they're kind of in a similar stage in life as well. And so, typically, younger coaches are more players like those coaches, and not nearly as hard-nosed. I feel like a lot of older coaches have, very strict systems. You got to do this, harder practices, which the Jazz have been known for being one of the harder practicing teams. So I don't know if that might be changing with the coaching change.
Yeah, I think, I hope is that the biggest change we'll see is defense. Obviously in San Antonio and Boston, defense is big there. I think coming from those types of, coaching experiences, coaching trees, I think he understands how to run an effective defense. But I think more than anything, again, to hopefully get his players motivated, especially the guards, to play good, solid defense and to hold the players accountable. So I don't know, that's what I expect to see, is maybe a bigger commitment to defense, especially on the perimeter.
Yeah, and Boston had a bunch of wings. Hopefully the Jazz actually decide to put some solid wings on the roster instead of all guards and bigs.
Yeah, I mean, a backcourt bigger than 6'1" will help with that.
Yeah. As I was looking into some things that were being said about Will Hardy, I actually went through and looked at some articles actually from San Antonio from a couple years ago, where there were some San Antonio sports writers who were talking about who is next in line to succeed Greg Popovich, because he's 73 now. He's getting a little bit older. There's been rumors now for like 3 solid seasons that he's just trying to break the wins record and then GTFO and start his retirement. And I was surprised that at the time when this was written, Will Hardy was only 30 years old. And even at that point, only having been an assistant in San Antonio for like 4 years at that point, he was already considered one of the most, one of the leading candidates for that job to succeed Popovich at only 30 years old and coming in to potentially replace one of the greatest coaches we've ever seen at all time. I don't know where you guys have him in your personal rankings. For me, he's definitely top 5. But and the reason they put it down is that he works harder than anybody. He's incredible at breaking down film and understanding what goes wrong during games and how you can fix that. And then they described him as a very creative and a very modern NBA coach, somebody who's coaching for what the modern game looks like and how can we actually take advantage of maximizing the league that is run by, kind of as Kyler alluded to, wings instead of just guards and bigs as it maybe was 10, 15 years ago. what changes do you hope Will Hardy will make to just how the Jazz plays that you think will actually make us a better team and hopefully get us out of that second round playoff rut that we've been trying to break through for the last several years?
Just going back to what I said, wings. Hopefully, he can push the front office to prioritize wings more than they have recently. And then another thing you said is creativity. I think just flexibility in game plan is something that was my number one criticism of Quinn by like at least a tier, if not two. So if we can just get a little bit, mid-series adjustments, mid-game adjustments, just stuff like that, that give us a better chance to win and make us a lot less predictable. That's my number one hope that Will Hardy can bring, I would say.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. If you can bring some versatility into the Jazz and with the Jazz run and some flexibility as far as being able to make adjustments, particularly in playoff time, that would be great. If he could find a way to make Rudy Gobert a plus offensive player, particularly in playoff time, assuming we still have him, he will have earned my respect for years to come.
Screen assist, man. Screen assist.
All right. Now we have Kyler doing our David Locke impression for the day. Yeah, I mean, Landon, I had somewhat similar thoughts to you, but instead of thinking how can we maximize Rudy Gobert on offense, my whole thought was I'd love to see a coach that really buys into more creative lineups and seeing lineups that we have that we're playing in the playoffs that maybe don't even involve Rudy Gobert. Like, how can we bring out a small ball lineup, even if it's only for 5-7 minutes a half during the playoffs, and actually make those minutes count? Because I've been somewhat disappointed, like with this last season, like seeing how Hassan Whiteside, how he had a very inconsistent motor and how he would scream a lot, wouldn't always get back on defense. And it seemed like the Jazz just had the system of that we have our guards, we have our bigs, and we're just going to keep running within our system. And I think it would be super, super cool to see if the Jazz can actually take players who could play maybe a small ball 5 role and see if we can actually make those minutes to be really plus offensively and potentially something we could even use in closing lineups. I'm not going to sit here and say that Rudy Gobert should be replaced in the playoffs. It's not what I'm saying at all. But I would love to see the Jazz become much more flexible with the minutes that we have or the matchups that we have when Rudy Gobert isn't on the floor, or when maybe he's not the best option to play for 38 minutes a night, and just really make sure that we're using our roster construction and our matchups to really maximize what the Jazz can do against them and not just say it's this way or bust.
It's time to unleash Eric Pascal for sure. Let him play.
I mean, I guess we'll see what happened. We've
Yeah,
joked
he
before
should have got
about
some run at least last year in the playoffs, but still.
He should have. I mean, for all we know, he's the Jazz's second greatest asset after Trent Force's contract. So we're just going to have to see what happens there. For the other big signing today, the Jazz also hired David Fizdale as an associate general manager for the Utah Jazz. And it's actually funny because even as early as 2 days ago, there were reports that he was in final round interviews for the head coaching position. And now we see him as a GM. Now, I don't know about y'all, but my overall impression of David Fizdale, especially going back the last few years, has not been the most positive. Now, he's been an assistant coach in the league, I think since 02 or 03, like with the Golden State Warriors. He was later an assistant coach on those Heatles teams with Bosh and Wade and LeBron. Got his first head coaching gig in 2016 for Memphis and was fired after like a season and a half for having a terrible start to the second season. Later, eventually went on to be the head coach for the Knicks and was fired after only 22 games into a second season after they went 4-18 in their first 22 games. And he hasn't really had a job since then because he was such a terrible head coach for the Knicks. So at least from a coaching perspective, I haven't had the greatest excitement for David Fizdale. And I never even really considered him as a guy who would be a front office guy, especially for the Jazz. What are your thoughts on David Fizdale in general? And do you think this is a role where he can actually be an asset to the Jazz instead of being a detriment like he may have been as a head coach for some of these other teams?
Well, we're definitely not getting rooked with him in our organization, right? No one's punking the Jazz. Yeah, no, this was interesting to me. I don't know how this happened. I don't quite know what his responsibilities are going to be. I'm definitely glad he's not going to be our head coach. He's doing another responsibility, but I just want to know more about what his responsibilities were or are going to be as that associate general manager. Like, what does that mean?
I honestly don't know. I think he just seems like he's just going to be another voice in the room, right? We have a really young owner in Ryan Smith, and so he's done the best he can. I think he's actually done a very admirable job of just putting a lot of voices around him just to kind of make sure he's not just kind of going off and doing his thing and messing up the Jazz, you know? And so just another experienced voice in the room, a guy with coaching experience that can maybe also help our super young coach. I mean, like J. Bobby said, he wasn't the best coach, but at least he has experience. And so maybe he can kind of coach Will Hardy along some of the, you know, bumps and bruises you get along the way as being a head coach. And so as long as he's kind of just more of another voice in the room, you know, kind of on the round table of the decision-making process, and he's not really doing too much on his own, I think it's a fine deal just to get an experienced opinion.
Yeah. I think if there's anything that makes me excited about David Fizdale, which honestly isn't much, is that he does have a lot of experience. I think he's been involved with like 6 or 7 organizations all across the league. So he definitely knows a lot of people, which just as a guy who can make a phone call and get more info is always going to be valuable in this league. But most importantly, he's a guy who's been around winning teams. I mean, if you look at when he was an assistant in Miami, he was around one of maybe the 4 or 5 best teams of this century with those LeBron, Wade, and Bosh teams. And he saw a team that was able to win and go to the finals consistently at the highest level. So even if he may not be able to bring what we need to get to that point where we hope to eventually be in the same position where we're competing in the finals year after year, or at least getting close to it, hopefully he is a guy who can help bring that perspective of I've been there, even if I was there in a lesser capacity. And maybe I can help just be, like Kyler said, a voice in the room who can help maybe leading guy to saying, maybe here's some areas that we can shore up. Here's some things that we were doing back in Miami 10 years ago that really helped us become a borderline dynasty in this league. So I don't know if I'm 100% like super excited that David Fizdale is an associate GM for the Jazz, but he is somebody who does have a lot of experience, who knows a lot of people, and can hopefully bring a perspective that would be valuable, even if his direct contributions may not be the most valuable in the world, I think is maybe the way that I'll put it.
I think the only problem with that is his most successful team, Miami, like you were saying, that's not really a way that the Jazz are going to win. You're not going to have Dwayne Wade recruit LeBron and Chris Bosh over in a single offseason. I mean, we do have Dwayne Wade, so we have the first piece of that puzzle, but I doubt we're getting the second and the third. So, yeah, I mean, he's been part of a winning team. I feel like the recipe for success for the Jazz is going to be quite a lot different than it was for that Miami team.
Yeah.
Which I think you're right on that. I'm just looking for any silver lining I can about David Fizdale joining the Jazz, and maybe he'll help us, maybe he won't, but I think you make a good point.
Yeah. We're so young, he's old, so just balance. That's what we're seeking here, balance.
I do think he's very charismatic, and I do think he has a lot of connections throughout the league, so he could maybe be a point of contact as far as like something like free agency goes. I think he could maybe be a guy who could really connect with potential players and help them buy into the Jazz and what, you know, we're all about. So, I mean, that might be a potential plus side of having him in the room.
Well, we will definitely learn more as the season progresses. Is Will Hardy as good as we project him to be? And is David Fizdale going to bring a lot of value to the Jazz organization? Just real quick before we close out the segment, we like doing grades on this podcast. We think it's a fun way to evaluate our opinions. So, Kyler, Landon, quick lightning round. What would you give on a letter grade for the Will Hardy signing and then also for the David Fizdale hiring?
I'd give a B+ and a C, and I'll let you guess which one's which. It's not that hard.
Landon?
Will Hardy, A-. I think it's a very high risk, high reward proposition, which is something I think the Jazz need. I think it's a good hire. Fizdale, I don't know, C. Yeah, we'll see what he does.
All right. So This message is going directly out to Will Hardy and to David Fizdale. Will Hardy, we are excited to have you on the Jazz. We're full supporters. David Fizdale, we're kind of iffy on the fence. We're glad you're here. Prove us wrong. We hope you become an A hiring for us. That'll wrap it up for part 1 of this podcast. We will be back with part 2, where we're going to be talking a little bit more about the draft by we had some recommendations, right, Kyler, of some of our listeners who wanted to talk more about the Jazz.
Both of our fans requested that we review the draft, so we're going to be doing it.
All right, so part 2, we won't be talking about the Jazz as much. We'll be talking more about the draft in general, but we will be back with another podcast here later this week where we'll talk more about some of the signings for the Jazz. So stick around for part 2 if you want our breakdown analysis of the NBA draft, and we'll be back with more Jazz-specific content next week. So this will wrap up part 1, and we'll be back here shortly with part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of the Upper Bowl Perspective. In part 1, we broke down the hiring of Will Hardy as the new Jazz head coach and David Fizdale as an associate GM. And part 2, even though we are a Utah Jazz podcast, we're going to talk very, very little about the Utah Jazz. Because for the first time since 1992, the Jazz did not have a pick in the first or the second round. First time in 30 years. For all of our fans, just so you know, all 3 of us on the night of the draft, we watched the first 44 picks together in my living room, just hoping against hope that the Jazz would get a pick or a trade somewhere. Did not end up happening, but our listeners, even though we were sad that we did not have a pick in this year's draft, we do definitely want to listen to you and your requests for what we talk about. So for this segment, we're just going to be talking about the draft in general, although there will be little Jazz content because the Jazz didn't do anything on draft night.
It was like that meme, like the do something with the guy poking a stick. That was basically us all draft
exactly
night.
What it was.
But it didn't work.
Oh, yeah. It's like we got to the 16th pick, which the Jazz were rumored to be in contention for. We're like, are they going to do it? And then it didn't happen. Same thing with 18. Then we were just waiting for them to buy a pick in the 40s, and it didn't happen. Anyway, we probably waited way too long watching the draft, hoping the Jazz were going to do something, but it didn't end up happening. The big story going into this draft were what was considered the big 3 of prospects and where they were going to go in the first order. Those 3 prospects were Jabari Smith, Chet Holmgren, and Paolo Banchero. And the top 3 teams in order as they were picking was the Orlando Magic, then the Oklahoma City Thunder, and finally the Houston Rockets. Leading up to the draft, there was news for weeks that Jabari was going to go number 1, that he really fit in well with their current system, that they thought he was the best player in the draft. And then about, 4 hours before the draft, we started hearing rumblings. We saw the Vegas odds starting to move on who was going to go first. And with rumors that Paolo was actually going to go number 1 to the Magic. And that's what ended up happening. Paolo Banchero went first overall in the draft to the Magic. Chet Holmgren went number 2 to OKC, which left Jabari Smith open for 3rd for the Houston Rockets. So here's my question, because there's been a lot of debate. A lot of other people have talked about these picks. But in general, do you think that the Magic made the right pick choosing Paolo Banchero as the number 1 overall pick in the draft?
That's a tough question for me. He was my number 1 player in the draft. I love Paolo Banchero to death. I think he's really, really good basketball player. And so obviously I can't say they made a bad decision taking the best player in the draft in my eyes. I question the fit next to their other forward that they have right now in Franz Wagner. They're really similar players. But at the first overall pick, are you worrying about fit? I loved the way Chet Holmgren, who's my number 2 player, how he fit in between Wagner and Wendell Carter. Or Wendell, that's right. I'm psyching myself out here. And so just fit-wise, even though I liked Paolo more, I was kind of rooting for Chet to go there because I felt like that was his best spot for success. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I like the pick because they picked the best player in the draft in my eyes.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I think that Paolo had the highest potential of any player in this draft. I think if anyone's going to come out to be a superstar, I think it's going to be Paolo. And so I think in the case like Orlando, I do think they have some nice pieces. You mentioned Franz Wagner. I think he's a fine player. But is he like a superstar? What's his ceiling? I think Paulo's probably got a higher ceiling. I think he's got higher potential to be a star. So I think that's probably not something you're going to want to pass up on, especially for a team like Orlando Magic. I think is still trying to find its identity, find its structure and find its way to success. And I think, the fit is definitely questionable, but I think, in the era of basketball we're in where everything's essentially positionless, I think there's definitely ways you could put him and Franz on the court at the same time and really kind of run a functioning offense out of that. So I'd support the pick. I don't fault Orlando for selecting him at all.
Yeah. It's definitely hard to pass up on a guy who's 6'10" and a half. Apparently that's what he measured at the combine without shoes, who projects to be most likely the best offensive player of the draft, a guy who can create his own shot. Because when you have that combination of scoring ability and size, I don't know about y'all, but that's like, if you're trying to make the next best thing in the NBA, those are probably two of the things that you grab first, is that scoring ability and that size. For me, I certainly didn't hate the pick. For me, I flip-flopped on my rankings about 4 different times on how I had those top 3 ranked. And going into the draft, I finally decided that Jabari was my number 1 guy for the draft. So for me personally, I think that Paolo was the second best option for them. I like Jabari just a little bit more, just because I think Jabari is a sure thing in what he's going to be. Do I think Paolo has a little bit of a higher ceiling than Jabari? Probably a little bit, but I do love Orlando's young core. There's a lot of players I love. I love Franz Wagner, and I thought that Jabari was the type of guy who could be almost maybe like his ceiling, I think, is just under what Paolo's could be, and his shooting ability is truly elite. So if I were the Magic, I probably would have taken Jabari, just because I think that he's somebody who projects to be just as good as Paolo in a lot of areas and fits extremely well with what they're trying to do. But I think that with their mindset, if they thought Paolo was the best player, you should always prioritize the player over the fit. It's just, for me, where I had Jabari a little bit higher on my big board than Paolo, then I think that's where we differ just a little bit. But it certainly wasn't a bad pick.
Yeah, I think there's value in like taking away what you saw from the last playoff run, especially in the finals. And one of my biggest takeaways was it's very, very hard to find somebody that's a reliable number 1 option when the defense is locked in in the clutch moments of like the conference and the NBA finals. Even a guy like Jason Tatum had a horrible finals, who was viewed as like one of the best young scorers in the entire league. And so in terms of this draft, I think Paolo is the only one that has the potential to be that. I think Jabari is limited in how much he can create for himself, and Chet's this unicorn player that's amazing defensively, and I think he can be good offensively. But in terms of the guy who can be that guy for you in the last 5 minutes of a game 7 and can just go out and get a bucket, I think Paolo might be the only one that I would at least count on. There's always some random dude later in the draft that surprises, but at the top of this draft, I think he's the only one with that skill set.
Yeah, which I think that's fair. Out of those top 3 guys, who do you think has the best chance of winning Rookie of the Year? Which I know that we're projecting way far in advance here, but just thinking about these different players and their fits on their individual teams, who do you think is going to win Rookie of the Year, or do you think it's someone outside of the top 3?
I think the analytics darlings are going to root for Chet like all season long, but Paolo's just so NBA ready, and I think he's got better surrounding cast if Orlando can stay healthy. So I would go for Paolo. I think he's going to be able to get buckets year 1. My only worry with him is if you come in and you're a teenager that's already 6'10", 250, like if he gains a little bit of weight, all of a sudden he's going to lose a lot of that dynamic power. And so I'm glad he didn't go to like Houston, which is a city that's notoriously has very large. It's very easy to get fat in Houston. But that's the one worry I have with Paolo. But I don't think it's going to show up in his rookie year, so I'd vote for him. I'd bet on him if I was a betting man.
What about you, Landon?
I would probably say Chet Holmgren. I think he's the most poised to have the most seamless NBA transition. He's got some really good pick and roll partners in OKC with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Josh Giddey. I think he's going to be spoon-fed a lot of really good buckets. He's very well-rounded, right? He can play both ends of the floor very well. He's probably going to be very efficient. So like Kyler said, I think the analytics are going to love him. And I think OKC's primed to, I think, surprise some people this year. I think they're going to be more competitive than people might think with the talent I have. So I could see him, possibly making the playoffs, or at least making maybe to the play-in tournament. If not him, I think Jaden Ivey also, I think, has some real potential to do some real good things in Detroit.
Yeah. I don't know what the rankings are. I haven't looked at the Vegas odds. I think Jaden Ivey definitely has a shot playing next to Cade Cunningham on Detroit. That's definitely going to be interesting. I'm so excited to watch Detroit next season, guys. It's going to be so much fun. But to answer that question, I would put the slight edge to Chet. I think that Paolo's definitely going to be first team all rookie. I think he's going to be the best offensive player this year. I think it's going to take Paolo a little bit of time to become NBA defense ready. I don't think he's going to be a terrible defender, but I think it's going to take him some time to actually become really competent on that end. That was his biggest draw coming out of college, was how good is he as a defensive player, where Chet is projecting to come out as an amazing defensive prospect. So even though I think Paolo is going to be the guy, he's going to have the most highlight reels, he's going to have the most crazy, insane plays, he's going to have probably a couple of incredible fourth quarters this year that are going to win the Magic some games. I think when you look at Chet, he's going to be a guy who's probably scoring 14 with 7 or 8 rebounds, a few assists, and plays really, really good defense. And I think just as an overall player and the impact that Chet's going to have playing with guys like Josh Giddey, like Shea, like Lou Dort, if he ends up staying with OKC, he's going to be someone who's going to be able to make an impact in multiple ways on the floor. And even though I don't think his offensive impact is going to be as high as Paolo or even Jabari, I think his overall impact to the team is going to be the most noticeable. And if we look at Scotty Barnes last year, I think that kind of lets you know what the voters are looking for when they vote for these things. They're looking at both ends of the court, and I think that Chet has the biggest potential of being able to impact both the offensive and defensive ends of the court. Even if he's not going to reach, I don't think, the same offensive highs as a Paolo or a Jabari.
Yeah, and I think definitely from going through who's going to have the better career overall, I would definitely go more towards Paolo or Jabari Smith. But as far as who I think is going to make the fastest impact next season, I would definitely stick with Chet.
I think it depends on how OKC plays him. I think he definitely has the possibility, but they kind of lack quality big men. And so if they try to make Chet play like a traditional 5, I think he might get a little bit bodied. But I think his best role is as a 4 next to a physical 5. So we'll see what OKC does. There's still free agency, which is what we might be talking about soon. But so yeah, I think Chet certainly could have a seamless transition. It's just, I think it depends on how OKC fleshes out their roster.
No, it'll definitely be interesting. I mean, I completely agree with you, Kyler. I think his best role is playing a 4 next to a physical 5. And if you look at, sure, he may be playing with Derek Favors next season, but if you look at the other tall guys they have on that roster, Poku maybe weighs 95 pounds soaking wet, and Ousmane Dieng, who they ended up taking with the 11th pick in the draft, he's not exactly super physical or beefy yet. They've still got to build out their bodies, but it's definitely going to be interesting. I have OKC as my number 1 league pass team next year that I want to watch outside of the Jazz just because I love so many of their young players. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see how these prospects who've been so highly touted for now going on 3 or 4 months, how they're actually going to perform. But even though this was the consensus top 3, they may not have been our favorite picks of the draft. As we've seen in the past, some of the best draft picks in history are those who maybe didn't go super, super high, but were picked maybe late lottery or even into first round or second round that end up becoming really franchise-altering guys. For the Jazz, we had that Donovan Mitchell, who was picked at the end of the lottery, or maybe even a guy like Draymond, who was picked 35th, who ended up being one of the best role players of all time, just came off winning his 4th championship. When you think about this draft in general, who was your favorite pick? Which guy do you think was maybe fell a little bit, maybe should have been drafted a little bit higher, and you think he's going to project to be better than where he was drafted?
Man, I feel like I have multiple answers for this question. I could talk about the draft. I know we've said it previously, but I follow the draft to a religious level. But I think the guy that really should be talked about, we've mentioned his name, but I want to go into it, is Jaden Ivey. Sacramento was on the clock. Everyone thought he was going to go. He was, in some people's eyes, he was in the first tier with those three. If not, he was almost everyone's consensus 4. He was actually ranked 6th for me. So he actually went higher than my ranking, but I love the pick so much is because out of the top 10 teams, Detroit was the only team that I absolutely loved him on. I know when we talked about the mock-off season that I thought Donovan was a really good fit next to Cade, because Cade just needs, if Cade has any weaknesses, he's just not this great athlete, right? And so if you put this super athletic, quick guard that can push the pace next to him, I feel like that's a great fit, and that's exactly what Jaden Ivey is. He's not this great shooter, and he's 6'4", so he's undersized to be kind of that second guard, right? But if you put him next to a big guard like Cade, you mitigate a lot of that risk. And so on draft night, I said if Detroit drafted Jaden Ivey, I would watch a lot of Detroit Pistons basketball. And they went out and got Jalen Duren as well, who is by far, I think, the best center in this draft. So I will be watching a lot of Detroit. So that would be at least my first answer if I don't get too greedy and say a second one later.
Yeah. I mean, after that whole, I mean, the fact that you have Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey, who was like the best guards in the draft, like back to back, are like, where do they rank in terms of most fun or most talented backcourts in the league? Because if you think of other like guard combos, yes, they're young, yes, they're inexperienced, but Cade had an amazing rookie season, and Jaden Ivey projects as a guy who's going to come in and be able to play right away and be really, really good for that team. So, like, which backcourts are actually better than Detroit right now? Like, who would you rather watch in terms of guard combos?
Who's better, I think, is a lot longer list than who would I rather watch, just because it's hard. Like, can you honestly say that Cade and Jaden Ivey's better than even like Donovan and Mike? Like, those are both really proven, really good basketball players. So I think the list of who I would rather watch is a lot shorter. I mean, Steph by himself, Kyrie by himself. I just love watching them. I don't care who they're next to, but there's not really much else. We're gonna have to see kind of what happens with Zach LaVine. He might be paired with a really exciting partner this summer, but yeah, top 5 for sure for me in terms of who I want to watch in a backcourt.
It'll definitely be fun to see what Detroit does. That's for sure. Landon, what about you? What was your favorite pick?
I had 2. I mean, one of them I would definitely say is Shaedon Sharpe. I know we didn't see him in college, but if you look at some of, his mixtapes and things like that, is like the way he plays, I think he has potential to be very good and very entertaining to watch, especially in a backcourt with Damian Lillard. So he's someone that I kind of like. I mean, I know he's kind of a risk, kind of a wild card, but I think, if anything, I think he'll be very fun to watch.
That boy
Another
can finish, yeah.
Yeah. Another guy I'm interested to see is Jaden Hardy. He went late in the second round. I know at certain points in time he was projected to possibly be a lottery pick. I think he could, be a potential steal. I think he's probably going to have a chip on his shoulder. I mean, who knows what he'll be able to do in Sacramento, but he's someone that I've got tabs on. He's someone I'm interested to see what he can do.
He got traded to Dallas. I was
He did
so
get traded to Dallas,
mad.
that's
Oh,
right.
did he?
When
I
he
didn't
was
see
right.
that.
I was so mad when he got drafted by Sacramento because he was a top. I thought there were 17 lottery quality picks in this draft, and he was one of them for me. And so I was so mad that the Jazz weren't buying a pick. I mean, the Lakers got 35. Like, there were picks available in that range where he was available. But yeah, I love that he got traded. I love especially that he got traded to Dallas because I can actually root for him.
Yeah, I mean, when he got drafted to Sacramento, because I had him in my tier just below your tier that you talked about of like lottery level guys, I had him like right below as someone I had in my late teens. And when I saw him going to Sacramento, I'm like, he's done. He's never going to be a good basketball player if he's a second round pick to Sacramento of all places. But knowing that he's not going to be able to play alongside Luka and develop there, that gives me a lot more hope for Jaden Hardy's future because I really loved him even a year ago before he had a disappointing season. As for me, every year I have a guy that leading up to the draft, I just fall in love with like 3 or 4 days before. Sometimes it works out. Like I absolutely loved, like I fell in love with Luka probably 4 or 5 days before the draft. And sometimes it doesn't work out near as well, like when I fell in love with James Wiseman. And but this year I have my guy that shot at my leaderboard right before the draft that I just cannot wait to see play basketball, and that's Dyson Daniels. As I was going through and looking at some of his tape, the dude is huge. I mean, like as a guard, he's someone who's going to be so good defensively just because of his size. He has a good motor. Well, there's maybe a couple basketball things he needs to work on to actually become like an NBA ready starting caliber guard. He's just the type of guy that when I watch him play, it's like he's like a mismatch nightmare because he's huge. He plays hard. Apparently, he works hard and is a really high character guy. And he has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder just because how he's been trying to increase his draft stock over the last few years because he started off as a lower ranked player. So for me, out of all the guys that I saw, seeing Dyson Daniels in a position playing for the Pelicans where he's going to be alongside vets like CJ McCollum and other young stars like Zion Williamson, I think that very similar to Javen Ivey, he's going to be in a place where he's going to have all of the opportunity in the world to succeed, and that he's going to be able to develop his skills, learn from like the guys like CJ, but potentially be part of a young core that they're trying to build in New Orleans that could hopefully be good here in a few years from now. So Dyson Daniels is my crush of the draft. I absolutely loved him as a player. And out of all the places he could have potentially gone in the first round, I think he went to one of his best options.
Really, that's funny because I loved him. He was my 5th best player on my board. I love Dyson Daniels just like you do from the second I first watched him. But I don't like the Pelicans. I'm not saying I don't like the fit with the Pelicans. I just hate the Pelicans. I don't know why. It's probably because Brandon Ingram drops 40 on us and we can't play defense every time we play him. But so that one was more of a sad one for me because I can't find myself rooting for Pelicans players. It's just impossible.
Yeah. JR, I'm surprised you didn't say someone like Nikola Jovic. Seems like he fits your MO pretty well.
Yeah, he was low on Nikola Jovic,
Okay.
man. That was like the first time in history. I asked him about him pre-draft.
I actually had him as my backup if one of you talked about Dyson Daniels, and I was going to talk about Jovic. I think him going number 27 to the Heat is actually a really good spot for him to land. It wasn't that I didn't like Jovic. I just didn't like him as much as some of the other prospects, but him going to the Heat that late, I thought that was an amazing pick. I just didn't have him in like my top 15. But
It's disappointing.
I do like Jovic. I think he's going to be good. I'm excited. I mean, it's probably good because all the tall white guys that can shoot that I've missed on the last several years in the draft, maybe I'm actually learning from my mistakes, but we'll see what happens.
Don't learn from your mistakes, man. Keep true to yourself. One last thing. I said I would probably plug a second player. I think the second best pick in the second round was Max Christie, who was bought for the 35th pick, which I think that one's the one that may be the most frustrated, right? The Lakers bought it. And like Ryan Smith, just buy the pick. You had at that spot, you could have picked either Jaden Hardy or Max Christie. I thought both were slam dunks. I thought Max Christie should have been a first rounder, like easily top 25 player. It's kind of like a Dyson Daniels, but light. He does everything really well, but he's more of a projection as a shooter. But I'm confident in that shot. So if you want Dyson Daniels, but you don't pick until 35, I think like Max Christie is kind of that guy.
Landon, who did you have as your second round darling that you think may become the next Draymond type of impact player out of the second round? Because I think Max Christie is a really good option there, and Jaden Hardy, who we've talked about, but I think there's a couple more that we could potentially see being valuable.
I don't know. I wasn't super high in the second round. Maybe someone like, I would say Jalen Williams. He went to OKC as well. He's big body. He's like 6'10", 237. He's a center. I think, he could be solid. I don't know if he could necessarily be, a star, but I think he's the type of player who could have like some real longevity in the league, just be kind of a backup 5 play.
That's
I think he's
pick. I was on him too. He's really good at drawing fouls, which you don't see a ton in centers, but I think he's really fun because typically centers always go out for blocks, but he would like actually attempt to draw charges, and he was pretty good at it. So he was just kind of a fun, quirky center watch for me because it was so different from any other center that I watched in this draft. He has a little bit of a shot. He has like a very slow set shot, but it goes in. So he even projects to have some range. So I think that's a good pick, Landon.
Yeah. I agree. I think he's got some, NBA skills that could keep him around.
Yeah. I'll just quickly talk about my guy who went in the second round. I actually had him as the last guy in my could be a lottery pick tier. I think they're that good, even though a lot of people disagree with me, and that was EJ Liddell. I just think he has an NBA-ready body. I think he has a lot of really good skills. I think he's a smart player. I think he works hard. Just like watching his tape, I just saw him as a guy who could be like your third or fourth forward coming off the bench as a guy who plays in the league for the next 8 or 9 years, just because he doesn't make bad decisions. He's a competent shooter. He plays good defense, and he's just the type of guy that I think will be out of the second round, could be a rotation player just because he has that combination of size, skill, and not huge glaring faults. And I found out in preparation for doing this podcast that me and EJ Liddell actually have the same birthday, December 18th. So he just has to be my second round guy.
Wow.
He has got to be my guy. He's only 22 years old. So I'm super excited to see what EJ Liddell could potentially be in the league a few years from now.
Yeah, I agree. He was my third favorite pick in the second round. So we talked about all my second round guys that the Jazz could have bought. So we talked about all the guys that are pain points for me. So that's lovely. I think he's kind of like a tweener person, which 5 years ago is viewed as a negative, but now where it's just throw some wings out there and it'll work. I think he works a lot better in today's NBA than he would have literally just 5 years ago.
I agree. All right. So there were a few different teams that had a lot of different draft picks, but out of all the teams that had multiple, which team do you think won the draft?
I kind of already previewed it, so I'm not going to talk long on it. The Pistons. For the last several seasons, the Grizzlies have been my second favorite team to watch. Then they all of a sudden got good, so I couldn't pick them anymore, and I think I'm shifting to the Pistons. So go Pistons. 2 awesome fits with Cade, I think. So that's my pick.
What about you, Landon?
Who do I think won the draft? Honestly, I would probably have to say Detroit as well. I think they're poised to have, a really good solid core now that I think could really be a contending team in a couple of years. I think they really solidified that this draft. So yeah, I just have to agree with Kyler. Them are the Knicks.
I think Spike Lee is going to come after you.
The Knicks were involved in the Pistons getting Jalen Duren, so go
that is true.
The one thing that I have questions with the Pistons, sorry, before you go, J. Bobby, real quick, is the Jeremy Grant trade was all about shedding salary, and it was presumed to go after DeAndre Ayton, but then they drafted a first-round center. So that, kind of, maybe they're actually going after a Miles Bridges or something of that manner, but I still love the pick. I was just wondering why you were so anxious to shed Jeremy Grant's salary. And maybe they just didn't want to count on getting Jalen Duren in the draft, which is honestly smart. So,
yeah. I mean, it's pretty rare that the same team gets the number 1 projected guard and the number 1 projected big in the same draft, which is exactly what Detroit did. Even though this is becoming more and more of a wings league, the fact that they got Duren and Ivy shows that they had a really, really great draft, which I'm super excited for. Because you guys already picked Detroit, I'm going to zag a little bit. I'm going to say OKC, just because of the fact that I love Chet. I love the Ousmane Dieng pick. I think that he's going to be really good. They had both of the Jalen Williams. I mean, they had 4 really solid picks in the draft that if you told me that any of them are a starting caliber player, in the next 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised with any of those 5 guys. And then similarly, if you told me in 5 years that Ousmane Dieng or Chet Holmgren are all-stars in the league, I wouldn't be surprised by that either. So I think they're kind of shotgunning it a little bit. Like, let's just get 4 big guys who have like some really good skills and see what happens. So even though I don't think they have the same top tier talent that maybe Detroit got, because they did get the best big and the best guard of the draft, I think it's going to be really fun to see what ends up happening with Chet and Dieng and Jalen Williams times 2.
Well, I think Chet could be
OKC.
considered a big though, right? Like he's a 4-5, which is really a big. But
Well, I mean, between him and Poku, that nickname, the Thin Towers, is my new favorite nickname in the entire league. So we'll see what happens. I think he still projects as a guy who would be better as like a power forward, maybe than a center, but we'll see what Chet ends up turning into and if he can get a little bit more meat on his bone so that he can bang down low with the rest of the bigs. But we'll see.
Yeah.
It was a fun draft. We got a lot of players we can see what will happen with.
yeah, Ousmane Dieng was my number 4 rated player in the draft, so it's tough for me not to pick OKC. But they already have so many Ousmane Diengs that I was so sad that my number 4 player went to somewhere that I feel like he's not going to be as featured as maybe he could be. So that's why the fact that I didn't like that fit for Ousmane Dieng made me dislike the OKC draft a lot more than I should.
Yeah. What do you guys think about Houston? Because I think they actually did pretty well too. They were able to snag Jabari Smith with that 3rd pick. They got Tari Easton and then Ty-Dye Washington later in the draft. I think those are all solid picks, I think, with some good potential as well.
I was a little bit lower than consensus on Tari Eason, but like still a solid. They actually got 2 wings, which we're talking about how important wings are and how much we wish the Jazz had wings. So the fact that they got 2 really solid wings should be commended. And it's really funny that I've been so like wings, and then I said the team that won the draft didn't get wings. So maybe I'm a bit hypocritical.
I mean, like for me, I'm not as big as Tari Easton on the album as a lot of people. I mean, like I still think he's a good player. I don't think he was a bad pick. I love the pedigree of Ty-Ty. So I think Ty-Ty is a guy who could definitely be like a solid guard in the league. And then like Jabari, he was obviously number 1 on my big board. So I love Houston as well. It's just Houston, man. Like after the absolute crap show that's been the Houston Rockets ever since like James Harden started to talk about leaving, I don't have a ton of faith in that organization to maximize the talent of all 3 of those guys, but I'm certainly hopeful because I do like all 3 of those players in a vacuum, even if I don't love Tari Eason. So it'd be fun to see what they could do.
I actually like Houston. I don't feel like they're as big of a crap show as you make them seem like they are. I feel like Washington's a crap show, but that's a story for another day.
That is a story for another day. But to our fans, we gave you our 30 minutes or so on the draft. One of our favorite days of the year. We talked about a lot of players. We talked about a lot of teams. If you have any questions for us that you want to answer in our next podcast, we do have an email where we will be taking questions and addressing those in the pod. It's upperbowlperspective@gmail.com. Wanted to make it as easy as possible for you. But if you do have requests for future shows, just send us a message and we will be happy to incorporate that into future shows. That'll wrap it up.
Check the comment section if you want to ask a question there. So if you don't want to send an email, just comment. Yep. I check those.
Email, YouTube. If you request it, we are going to talk about it. But that will wrap it up for today's edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective. As always, thanks to Landon and Kyler for talking hoops with me. As always, we will actually be launching another pod here quicker than we normally do because Kyler's going out of town, where we will be going over the 3 guys that the Jazz signed in free agency. The guys who didn't get drafted that we signed to both 2As and Exhibit 10 contracts. And in the second part of the next pod, we're going to be dropping off some of our favorite targets for the Jazz in real free agency. So once again, this is the Upper Bowl Perspective, and we'll be back with more Jazz-centric talk starting next pod. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you soon.